The air in the living room was thick and heavy, like a wool blanket on a summer night. It pressed down on me, making it hard to draw a full breath. Julian stood over me, his body a tall, dark silhouette against the soft glow of the lamps. A single sheet of paper was clenched in one hand, a black pen in the other. His shadow spilled across the polished coffee table, swallowing my hands in darkness. I watched that shadow, not wanting to look up at his face. I already knew the expression I would find there. It was a cruel smile, a victor's smile, one that never, ever reached his eyes. His eyes, I knew, would be cold and flat, like little chips of ice. "It's simple, Clara," he said, and his voice was a low, smooth mockery. It was the voice he used when he was absolutely sure he had won. "Either sign or get out of my house." He leaned forward, placing the paper and the pen on the table in front of me. He said the words, "my house," with a special kind of emphasis, a sharp, possessive jab. A bitter laugh almost fought its way up my throat, but I swallowed it down. My house. My mind flashed with 1,000 images, a movie of the last 3 years playing in a single second. I saw myself at 4 a.m, my hands pale and dusted with flour, kneading dough until my shoulders ached. I saw myself hunched over spreadsheets at midnight, my eyes burning from the screen, turning my little bakery into a citywide success. I saw myself in meetings with architects, pointing at blueprints, choosing the warm color of the hardwood floors and the exact shade of white for the kitchen cabinets. I had paid for this house, not just with money, but with sweat and sleepless nights. I had paid for every single brick, every pane of glass, every nail hammered into its frame. And now, this man, my husband, stood here calling it his. He chuckled, a nasty, confident sound that echoed in the suffocating silence. He thought he had me trapped. He saw me as he had always seen me, quiet, agreeable Clara, the soft-hearted wife who would do anything to avoid a fight, anything to keep the peace. For years, I had let him believe that. I had smiled when he took credit for my ideas. I had stayed silent when he spent my earnings on expensive toys for himself. I had allowed the memory of the kind man I once loved to blind me to the greedy, hollow stranger he had become. But that blindness was gone now. The curtain had been pulled back, and all I could see was him, standing in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. "Sign it," he repeated, his voice impatient now. He tapped a sharp finger on the empty line at the bottom of the page. "It just puts the house in my name. For legal protection, you know. It's smarter this way." His lies were so lazy now. He didn't even try to make them believable. I finally lifted my gaze from the table and met his cold eyes. He was waiting for the tears. He was expecting me to plead, to bargain, to remind him of our good years. He wanted the drama. He wanted to see me break, to see me crumble, so he could feel strong. I decided, in that moment, that I would not give him the satisfaction. My own face felt like a calm, still mask. I let none of my inner storm show. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the pen. The cool plastic felt solid and real in my hand. The silence in the room was so complete that I could hear the thumping of my own heart, a steady, strong, defiant rhythm in my chest. Thump, 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 thump. As my hand moved, Julian's smirk grew wider. This was it, his victory lap. He thought I was giving in, a ruined woman with no fight left in her, signing away the last thing she had. I put the tip of the pen to the paper. The ink flowed out, a stark black line on the crisp white page. I wrote my name, Clara Thorne, on the dotted line. My signature wasn't shaky or rushed. It was clear and firm, the letters flowing as smoothly as they always did. It was an act of surrender, but it felt like an act of power. When I was finished, I carefully placed the cap back on the pen, the small click sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. I set it down neatly beside the document. Then I reached into my purse, my movements unhurried. I pulled out my set of keys, the heavy brass key to the front door, the small silver one for the back, the plastic fob for the garage. I held them in my palm for a moment, feeling their familiar weight. Then, I opened my hand and let them fall onto the table. The sharp clink of metal on wood was the sound of a chain breaking. I stood up, and my legs felt stronger than they had in years. I let my eyes sweep across the beautiful living room one last time. It was a lovely cage, gilded and comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. I had built it, and now I was setting myself free from it. "It's all yours now," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. I turned and walked to the front door without looking back. I refused to give him a final glance. I didn't need to see the look of triumph on his face. I could feel his arrogant stare burning into my back. I opened the heavy door, stepped out into the cool, fresh evening air, and closed it softly behind me. As I walked down the stone path to my car, a single tear I hadn't even known was there finally escaped and rolled down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of loss. It was a tear of pure, exhilarating relief. 5 years ago, the air didn't feel heavy and suffocating. It smelled like sugar and yeast and endless possibility. Julian and I lived in a tiny apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up, with furniture we'd found on the street, and dreams that were bigger than all 4 rooms combined. My dream was called the rolling pin. It was born in our cramped kitchen, a space so small you couldn't open the oven and the refrigerator at the same time. It started with my grandmother's old, flour-dusted recipe cards for sourdough bread and lemon drizzle cake. I would wake up in the dark, hours before the sun, my hands working the soft, living dough, my heart so full of hope it felt like it might burst. Julian was my biggest cheerleader back then. He was my official taste tester, my one-man marketing team. He would stumble into the kitchen, his hair a mess from sleep, and steal a warm croissant from the cooling rack before I'd even had my first sip of coffee. "You're a genius, Clara," he'd say, his mouth full of buttery flakes. "The whole world needs to taste this." He was the one who convinced me to take my baskets of bread to the weekend farmer's market. He held my hand, his grip warm and steady when I signed the lease for a tiny storefront I could barely afford. We painted the walls of that first shop ourselves, a cheerful sky blue. I remember laughing so hard I cried because he got more paint on himself than on the walls, and he chased me around with a blue-streaked hand trying to mark my face. The rolling pin wasn't an overnight sensation, but its success was warm and steady, like the slow rise of a perfect loaf of bread. People loved my recipes. They loved the feeling of the little shop, the bell that tinkled when they walked in, the smell of home that clung to their clothes when they left. Within 2 years, I had to hire staff. Within 3, lines were forming down the block on Saturday mornings. Money, for the first time in our lives, wasn't a tight, constant worry. It was then that I started to dream of a real home. But as my business grew, something in Julian started to shrink. The man who had celebrated every small victory with me now seemed quietly annoyed by the big ones. My long hours, once a symbol of our shared sacrifice for a dream, became a personal insult to him. "You're always so tired," he'd complain when I'd come home, my clothes smelling of flour and butter. "It's like you care more about that little hobby of yours than you do about me." A little hobby, that's what he started calling it. My business, the one that paid for our rent, our bills, his new car, his expensive clothes, was just my little hobby. The first time he said it, it felt like a tiny paper cut. I ignored it, but he kept saying it, and each time the cut got a little deeper. I remember one night with perfect, painful clarity. I had just won a major award, Best Bakery in the state. It was a huge deal. I came home glowing, clutching the beautiful glass trophy in my hands, so excited I felt like I was floating. I couldn't wait to show him, to see the pride on his face that used to be there. I found him in the living room of our new, half-built house, a glass of expensive whiskey, a brand I recognized from the bakery's accounts, in his hand. "Julian, look," I said, my voice bubbling with joy as I held out the award. "We won!" He glanced at it, just for a second. A flicker of something dark and unreadable passed through his eyes, and then he looked away, back at the wall. "That's nice, honey," he said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Did you remember to pick up my dry cleaning?" The joy drained out of me so fast I felt dizzy. It was like a bucket of ice water had been poured over my head. My biggest professional achievement, and he was asking about his shirts. It was such a small thing, but it was everything. His support had become a performance. When his friends came over to see the new house, he would walk them through the construction site, waving his arm around grandly. "We decided to put the marble countertops in here," he'd say. Or, "I designed this open-concept living space to maximize the natural light." He never said I. He always said we. But we both knew who had spent hours with the architect. We both knew who was signing the checks. He was stealing my success in little pieces, trying to wear it like a suit he hadn't earned. The dream we started together in that tiny kitchen had finally come true, but I was the only one living in it, and he had started to hate me for it. Building the house was supposed to be our greatest adventure together. It wasn't just a structure of wood and stone, it was meant to be the physical shape of our success. I found the land myself, a perfect plot on a gentle hill that overlooked the twinkling lights of the city. I would stand there in the evenings, imagining a home filled with light and air, with huge windows to let the world in, and a kitchen big enough to test recipes for an entire army. For me, this house was a symbol. It was my castle, built not by a king or inherited through a bloodline, but earned by a baker, one croissant and one loaf of bread at a time. But a castle needs a treasury to build, and this was no different. The cost was staggering. My business accountant, a wise and careful man named Mr. Peterson, sat me down in his quiet office. He spread my financial statements across his desk and shook his head gently. "Clara," he said, his voice kind but firm, "a standard mortgage on a property this expensive will be a millstone around your neck. The monthly payments will tie up all the business's cash flow. It could strangle the rolling pin's growth just when it's ready to explode." I felt my heart sink. "So, what do I do? Give up on the dream?" "Not at all," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "We just have to be clever." He then proposed a different path, a financial tool I had never heard of before. It was a special type of loan called a business expansion and asset leveraged loan. The name was a mouthful, but the idea, as he explained it, was surprisingly simple. The loan wouldn't be given to me personally, but to my company, the Rolling Pin, LLC. The house itself would be listed not as a personal residence, but as a business asset, like a new fleet of delivery vans or a giant industrial oven. It would be the primary collateral for the massive debt. Mr. Peterson looked at me over the top of his glasses, his expression serious. "This is a powerful tool, Clara, but you must understand the risk. The fate of this house is tied directly to the fate of your business. They are financially linked, and this is the most important part. Whoever holds the deed to the house is also legally responsible for the entire loan." Julian was in that meeting with me. I remember it vividly. While Mr. Peterson was carefully explaining the life-altering financial structure, Julian was slumped in a plush leather chair, scrolling through sports news on his phone. When Mr. Peterson paused, waiting for questions, Julian just waved a hand dismissively without even looking up. Yeah, whatever the bank needs," he mumbled. "Just get us the money so we can start building." He never read a single page of the thick loan agreement I spent 2 full nights studying. He saw the loan as a magic pot of gold, not the heavy chain of responsibility that it was. He didn't care about the details, only the glorious result, a magnificent house to show off to his friends. As the house rose from its foundation, skeletons of wood becoming rooms, Julian's spending grew more and more reckless. He saw the business accounts, now swollen with the loan money, as his personal wallet. A state-of-the-art home theater system with a screen the size of a wall appeared one day. "A housewarming gift to us," he announced proudly. A sleek, silver sports car showed up in the half-finished driveway a week later. "We deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor," he'd say with a grin, using the word your, only when it suited his narrative. I tried to talk to him, to gently explain that this money wasn't free, that it was a carefully balanced debt that had to be managed. "Don't worry so much, Clara," he'd say, patting my head as if I were a nervous child. "You're great at baking, but leave the big picture money stuff to me. I know what I'm doing." He had no idea what the big picture was. He saw the beautiful walls, the sparkling swimming pool, the 3-car garage. He saw a palace fit for a king. I saw those things too, but I also saw the mountain of debt they were built upon. He thought the house was a symbol of his rising status. He never understood that it was actually a complex financial instrument, a dangerous equation of asset and liability. He was a king strutting through a castle he didn't truly own, built on a foundation of legal documents he had never bothered to read. The first year in the house felt like living in a beautiful, silent movie. Everything on the surface looked perfect. The gleaming floors, the manicured lawns, the stunning views. But the sound had been turned off. There was no warmth, no laughter, just the hollow echo of our footsteps in the cavernous rooms. The happy couple who were supposed to live there had vanished, replaced by a successful woman and her increasingly resentful husband. Julian's small, cutting remarks about my hobby had curdled into a constant low-grade bitterness that soured the air between us. He stopped pretending to be proud and started acting like he was my boss, or worse, my warden. The inevitable explosion happened on a Tuesday evening. I was in my home office, a bright, airy room that was my one true sanctuary in the house. I was reviewing the quarterly profits for the rolling pin, and the numbers were glowing. We were doing better than ever. The door opened without a knock. Julian walked in and stood directly in front of my desk, a tall, imposing figure blocking the light from the window. "We need to talk," he said. His tone wasn't conversational. It was an order. I kept my eyes on the spreadsheet. "I'm a little busy, Julian. Can it wait?" "No, it can't." He pointed a finger at my computer screen, at the columns of black, positive numbers. "This is the problem. All this money, all these accounts, and I'm completely in the dark. It's all in your name, Clara. That's not how a marriage is supposed to work." I finally looked up at him, my brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "You've never wanted to be involved in the finances before. You always said it bored you." "Well, I'm not bored now," he snapped, his voice sharp. "I think we should have joint accounts. For everything. The business, the savings, all of it. And this house. It's only fair. I'm your husband." It had nothing to do with fairness. It was about control. He saw the power represented by those numbers on my screen, and he wanted it. The house wasn't enough anymore. Now he wanted the engine that had built it. "The business is a limited liability company, Julian," I explained, forcing my voice to stay patient and calm. "Mr. Peterson set it up that way to protect our personal assets. It's separate for a very important legal reason." His face flushed a deep, angry red. "Your accountant. It's always what your accountant says, or what your manager advises. What about what I say? Don't I get a say in our life anymore?" "This is my company," I said, and this time my voice was firmer. The patience had evaporated. "I built it from nothing. Of course you have a say in our life, but you don't have a say in how I run my business." That was the wrong thing to say. He looked at me as if I had physically slapped him. The mask of the concerned husband dissolved, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. "Your business?" he spat, his voice dripping with scorn. "The one that keeps you out until all hours? The one that paid for this house that you're trying to keep all to yourself? I live here too, or have you forgotten that?" From that day forward, the house became his singular obsession. He was like a dog with a bone, circling the topic endlessly. "We need to protect our biggest asset," he would say at dinner. He began to casually, then insistently, suggest that we should put the house deed solely in his name. His excuses were a rotating collection of flimsy lies. One day, it was for tax benefits he'd read about. The next, it was to protect it from any potential business lawsuits. Each new excuse was more transparent than the last, a thin veil over the greedy grab I saw so clearly. I knew exactly what he was doing. I saw it in his eyes every time he looked around the living room, but instead of fighting him, I changed my strategy. I became hesitant, uncertain. Oh, I don't know, Julian, I'd say, looking confused. That sounds so complicated. I'd have to talk to Mr. Peterson about all the legal stuff. My feigned reluctance only made him more determined. It fed his ego. In his mind, he was the brilliant strategist, cleverly persuading his simple, naive wife to give up her greatest prize. He had no idea that with every clumsy lie, with every manipulative tactic, he was simply showing me his hand. I was watching. I was listening. And I was quietly starting to make a plan of my own. The small cracks in the walls of our marriage were splitting wide open, revealing a foundation that was rotten to its core. The final weeks of our marriage were a quiet, cold war fought in the beautiful, sunlit rooms of the house. There was no shouting, just a thick, tense silence that felt heavier than any argument. Julian's strategy was one of passive aggression. He would leave legal articles on the kitchen counter, casually open to pages about asset protection and spousal property rights. He would take phone calls in the hallway, speaking in low, serious tones, making sure I could overhear carefully chosen words like deed transfer, sole ownership, and my lawyer. He thought he was a master strategist, a brilliant general slowly tightening a siege around my defenses. In reality, he was just a clumsy child trying to steal a cookie from a jar he couldn't quite reach, making as much noise as possible in the process. He finally got tired of the waiting game. He must have realized his subtle tactics weren't working, so he decided to lay a trap. He hired his own lawyer, a man named Mr. Harrison, to draw up the papers he so desperately wanted. He didn't tell me, of course. He waited for the perfect moment to spring it on me. That evening, he tried to recreate our past. He cooked dinner, a fancy steak dinner with a red wine reduction sauce, the kind he used to make for me on our anniversary. He poured 2 glasses of expensive wine, the bottle one I knew he'd charged to the business account. He lit candles. He talked about our future, about traveling the world, about finally relaxing now that we were so successful. It was all a performance, a cheap stage play where he was the charming, loving husband. I sat across from him, sipping my wine, watching the play for what it was, the final act. After dinner, he led me into the living room. He had lit the fireplace, even though the evening was warm, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the walls. And there, sitting on the center of the polished coffee table, was a thick, official-looking document. "Clara, my love," he began, his voice smooth and oily, a salesman's pitch. "I've had my lawyer draw up some simple paperwork. It's just like we talked about. A simple measure to protect our home, to protect our future together." He gestured for me to sit. I did, but I didn't look at him. I looked at the document. The words at the top were stark and clear. Quitclaim deed. My heart didn't race. It settled into a slow, steady beat. I scanned the dense legal language, the words blurring together until they formed the simple, ugly truth I already knew. It was a complete and total transfer of ownership of the house and the land it sat on, from Clara Thorne to Julian Thorne. I placed the paper back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. "I'm not signing this, Julian." The charming smile on his face didn't just fade, it vanished instantly, as if it had been a mask he'd ripped off. "What did you say?" "I'm not signing it." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing into slits. The loving husband was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. "After everything I've done for you?" he hissed. "I supported your little bakery when it was nothing. This house is a testament to our partnership." "You didn't do anything for this house, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You just live in it. I paid for it." The simple, unvarnished truth hit him like a physical blow. His face contorted in a wave of pure rage. He shot to his feet, his body trembling, towering over me where I sat on the sofa. The polite act was over. This was the real Julian, the one who had been hiding under the surface for years. "You ungrateful woman," he spat, venom dripping from every word. "You think you're so much better than me with your little shop and your precious money? But you are nothing without me. You'd still be in that tiny, pathetic apartment, dreaming your little dreams, if I hadn't been there to push you, to support you." He snatched the paper from the table and shoved it toward my face, rattling it in his fury. He grabbed the pen and threw it down in front of me. His hand was shaking. "You have two choices," he snarled, his face just inches from mine, his breath hot with anger. "Either sign or get out of my house." There it was. The ugly, final truth laid bare. In his mind, my success, my work, my home, it had all been absorbed by his ego, becoming his by right of marriage. I looked at his face, twisted by a greed so profound it had erased the man I once knew, and I felt nothing but a deep, sorrowful pity. The man I had married was long gone. This was a stranger. And in that cold, clear moment of understanding, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next day, the world felt brand new. I woke up not to the oppressive silence of a grand, empty mansion, but to the gentle morning light filtering through the window of a small, one-bedroom apartment I had secretly rented a month before. The sunbeam painted a warm square on the wooden floor, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel a heavy, anxious weight on my chest. There was no one to please, no one's fragile ego to manage, no tension to navigate before I'd even had my coffee. There was just me, the quiet hum of the city waking up outside, and a profound sense of peace that was more valuable than any house could ever be. I made a simple cup of coffee in a simple mug and sat by the window, feeling light. I was finally, truly free. I didn't need to be there to know how Julian's morning was going. I could picture it so clearly it was like watching a movie in my mind. He would have woken up late, stretching his arms out in the center of the king-sized bed in what he now considered his castle. He would have walked through the silent halls, a smug grin plastered on his face, touching the cool marble countertops, admiring the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had won. He had outsmarted me. He had secured his future. I could almost hear his voice booming through the empty house as he spent the morning on the phone, cementing his victory lap. "Yeah, she finally saw things my way," he'd be bragging to one of his friends. "The house is all mine now. It's just cleaner this way, you know? A man needs to be the master of his own home." I imagined him around noon, pulling a bottle of our best champagne from the fridge, champagne I had been saving for a special occasion. He would be pouring himself a celebratory glass, basking in the glow of his supposed brilliance, when his phone rang. He'd see the caller ID. "Mr. Harrison." He would answer with a cheerful, condescending laugh. "Harrison, my man, just the lawyer I wanted to talk to. You did a great job. Everything went off without a hitch." But the voice on the other end of the line wouldn't be cheerful. I imagined it as thin and tight, strangled with a panic Julian wouldn't understand at first. "Julian, I need you to sit down." "Sit down? Why? I'm celebrating." Julian would laugh, taking a sip of his champagne. "No, you don't understand," the lawyer's voice would say, rushed and sharp. "I just got back from the county records office. I was filing the new deed and I did a final check on the property's liens and encumbrances, just as a formality." There would be a pause, the sound of papers rustling frantically. "Julian, that house isn't just a house." Julian's smile would falter. "What are you talking about? It's a house. I'm standing in it." "No, I mean financially." Mr. Harrison's voice would be getting louder, higher pitched with rising horror. "The property is the sole collateral for a massive business development loan. It's a high-risk, high-interest loan under the name of the Rolling Pin LLC. The paperwork you had your wife sign, the quitclaim deed, it transfers the property's title completely. But a title doesn't travel alone. It travels with all of its financial attachments, all of its debt." I could see the color draining from Julian's face, the cold dread creeping up his spine. What debt? Clara paid for the house?" "She didn't pay for it, Julian. The business did. With a loan. And the document you had her sign legally transfers the asset, the house, from the business to you, an individual. In doing so, you have also legally assumed the entirety of the colossal debt attached to it." The champagne glass would suddenly feel impossibly heavy in Julian's hand. How much debt? He would whisper, his voice barely audible. There would be a sick, dead silence on the other end of the line. Then Mr. Harrison's voice, full of disbelief and pure, unadulterated horror, would deliver the final, devastating blow. Julian, the loan is for more than the house is even worth. You didn't just get the house, you took the chain that was attached to it. By signing that paper, you didn't ruin her. Do you realize you just destroyed yourself? The world Julian had tried to steal for himself collapsed with a speed that was almost silent. I didn't see it happen, but I knew it would. The first domino, I later learned, was a thick, formal letter from the bank. It arrived in an expensive-looking envelope, congratulating him on his new ownership of the property and politely informing him that the first monthly loan payment under his name was due at the end of the month. I can picture him opening it, a triumphant smirk on his face, only to have his eyes scan down to the number at the bottom of the page. I know he would have had to read it 3 times before his brain could even process it. The payment was an astronomical sum, more than 3 times the monthly salary from the marketing job he was so proud of. His first call would have been to Mr. Harrison, his voice a frantic scream of threats and blame. But the lawyer's response, I imagine, would have been tired and defeated. There is nothing I can do, Julian. The document is legally perfect. You wanted the house. You got the house along with everything attached to it. It's a legal and binding transfer. His next call would have been to the bank, where he would have tried to explain that it was all a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding. But the woman on the phone, polite but firm, would have told him what I already knew. The ownership and the liability had been legally transferred. The payments were his responsibility now. Desperate, he put the house on the market. He listed it for a ridiculously high price, hoping for a miracle. But the real estate agent he hired delivered the brutal truth. The housing market was down, and with the enormous lien against the property, a public record for any potential buyer to see, no one would touch it. The debt was far greater than the value. The house was, in financial terms, completely underwater. The house he saw as his kingdom had become his prison. I can see him, wandering through those beautiful, spacious rooms that now felt mocking and empty. The high ceilings that once felt grand would now seem to press down on him. Every gleaming countertop and polished floorboard would be a reminder of the crushing weight of his mistake. He was being buried alive by the very bricks he was so proud to own. Meanwhile, my life was getting lighter. The massive business loan, which had been a constant source of stress and a check on my ambitions, was gone. It was like a giant anchor had been cut loose from my company. The capital that had been tied up as collateral for the house was now free. I met with Mr. Peterson. He looked over my new debt-free business financials, a slow, wide smile spreading across his face. "Well, Clara," he said, his eyes twinkling over his glasses, "it seems you're in a perfect position for that expansion you've been dreaming of." 2 months later, while Julian was desperately trying to sell his designer furniture online to make a single loan payment, I was signing the leases for 2 new locations for the Rolling Pin, one in the busy downtown financial district and another in the wealthy suburbs. My business was about to double in size. My dream was growing bigger and stronger than ever, nourished by the freedom he had accidentally given me. The final notice arrived at the mansion on a rainy Tuesday. It was a foreclosure letter. The bank was officially taking the house. I imagined Julian standing in the grand entryway, the letter trembling in his hand, rain streaking down the tall windows like tears. He was a king with no castle and no kingdom, a man ruined by his own reflection. On that same rainy Tuesday, I was standing across the street from my new downtown bakery. A small team was carefully hanging a large, cheerful sign above the door, its bright blue letters a beacon in the gloomy weather. It read, "The Rolling Pin, Grand Opening." He had tried to take my house, but in the end I had walked away with my entire life, and I had never once looked back.